on this helium penalty question, when you boil it all down, it's simple. If you do less decompression, there's more risk.
You may have seen the recent video circulating online that had some divers doing some very deep dives with no helium programmed into their computer. I talked about it on my social media channels and it got a whole load of comments. And that kind of led into a discussion about the helium penalty. So I thought I would go straight to one of the world experts in decompression, physiology and medicine.
And I just come back to the fundamental message, which is, if you do less decompression, it's more risk.
I'm sure most people will know Professor Simon Mitchell. He's a diving physician. He's a professor at the University of Auckland. He's editor of the Diving and Hyperbaric Medicine journal. Perhaps most importantly, he's also a technical diver.
I'm very invested in getting the right answers for us.
So actually has a whole load of skin in this game himself. So in the conversation you're about to see, he explains what the helium penalty is, where it comes from, and then talks about some of the more recent research that is in place and provides some real practical advice on what that means to us and him as a diver. It's an absolutely fascinating interview. I think it will be really useful. I hope you enjoy it. Hello, Simon. Thank you very much for coming on to the Deep Wreck Diver channel.
Yeah, no, Dom, thanks for asking me, to talk about this. It's obviously a topic of some, considerable relevance to, all of our technical diving colleagues. So, happy to answer questions. Yeah.
There has been some research done on this. We've seen the paper that's on the Shearwater website, frequently referred to. I think it'd be useful to get your kind of summary of that.
Yeah, look, I wonder actually, though, whether it's worth just stepping back a little bit and looking at the origins of the helium penalty, because if you don't understand that, then it's pretty hard to have the debate about what the more recent research shows. And I can summarize that very quickly if that's acceptable to you.
Of course.
Yeah, well, the helium penalty is something that arose out of some, I think, assumptions that were made by Bühlmann back when he was doing his original research and design of his algorithm, based essentially on the physical properties of the various gases that he was considering. I think a fair summary of it is to say that Bühlmann assumed that helium would be a faster exchanging gas than nitrogen, and it's probably best just to keep it as simple as that, based largely on the fact that it's a smaller, more diffusible molecule, and therefore you would take up and actually eliminate helium more quickly than nitrogen. But what that meant was that on a dive where you were breathing a substantial amount of helium, you would build it up in your fast tissues more quickly. That would mean that during an ascent at the end of your dive, the fast tissues would start to reach their Bühlmann supersaturation limits with helium earlier than they would have if you were breathing nitrogen, because you've absorbed that helium really quickly. So this more rapidly absorbed gas would be the limiting gas as you started to ascend. And that would mean that you would require deeper stops, because those tissues that had accumulated a lot of helium would be reaching their supersaturation limits more quickly. And of course, during those deeper stops, you would be absorbing more gas in the slower tissues. And that would mean that at the other end of your decompression, the shallower end, you would have to spend longer to unload those slower tissues that have accumulated more gas during the deeper stops. And so that's where the helium penalty came from, because you had to stop earlier in the ascent because you've absorbed a larger quantity of inert gas, being helium. You had to spend more time at the other end unloading those slow tissues. And that was the origin of the helium penalty. Now fast forward to the work that David Dulett did in Adelaide some years ago, actually. He looked at helium versus nitrogen kinetics in a couple of tissues that were of relevance to the kind of diving that we do in terms of their on-gassing and off-gassing kinetics. And if I recall correctly, those two tissues were skeletal muscle and brain. In a very well-conducted, carefully calibrated experiment, he showed that, in fact, helium and nitrogen kinetics were quite similar in those tissues. It's important to understand that David wasn't saying there isn't a difference between helium and nitrogen. There actually is. If you actually compare total body outgassing from saturation on helium or nitrogen, helium is quicker. But that's whole body saturation. It's not the same as the kind of dives that we do where you don't get whole body saturation. So there is a difference in helium and nitrogen kinetics, but what David was saying is that in the tissues that are substantially relevant to what we do, the kind of dives, depths and durations that we do as tech divers, there's probably not as much difference as Bühlmann assumed there was. So that's the origin of the helium penalty. That is the current evidence about helium versus nitrogen kinetics in relevant tissues that David has published. I guess now the question is, well, how do we rationalize those two things? How do we interpret David's findings in relation to the Bühlmann prescriptions that were based on this assumption that helium was very different? So shall I go on and talk about that?
Absolutely, because there is a lot of people out there, I'm sure you know this already, who are simply not programming helium into their dive computers. I know some, I'm sure you do as well. And by and large, those people seem to be getting away with it, or it seems to be working for them. I guess it'd just be useful. We would all like a bit of clarity or an understanding of which way the risks go.
Yeah, well, there's only one way the risks go. Let's put it like this. If before any of this discussion emerged, right, and before any debate about the helium penalty emerged, I let's just say I'd gone online and said, hey guys, let's just cut the amount of decompression that we do by 30% or 20% or something like that. Everyone would have looked at me and gone, you're bonkers. Why would we do that? Like, people get bent doing what we do. This is when we were doing decompressions with the helium penalty in place. If I'd said, hey, let's just cut our decompressions, lots of people would go, yeah, you're bonkers, you're mad. But now what's happening is people are doing exactly that based on this idea that we don't have to account for the helium penalty. You're right, some people are getting away with it and some people probably aren't. What it really comes down to is the fact that, yes, over the years, we've been doing these decompressions that have assumed that the helium penalty is real, the difference in helium and nitrogen kinetics is real. We've adhered to the algorithms that have assumed that, and we've been doing these longer decompressions as a result. David's point, and I think it's very important, and it's kind of the view I subscribe to, is that, yeah, Bühlmann might have had it wrong in terms of some of the important tissues that are relevant to the kind of diving we do, but he may have been prescribing the right amount of decompression, but for the wrong reason. In other words, we were doing the kind of decompressions that you need for deep diving, but based on a flawed assumption. But what that means is if you then take that assumption away and do shorter decompressions as a result, your risk is going to be higher. And there's no doubt about that. I mean, it's simple. If you do less decompression, your risk is higher. So if you're going to be all clever and say, okay, well, we'll ditch the helium penalty, we'll tell our computers we're just diving on nitrogen, and we'll have shorter decompressions as a result. There's no magic that you've just suddenly invoked that reduces your risk or makes it the same as the risk you had before. You are assuming higher risk. There is absolutely no doubt about that. It's just simple physics, right? You spend longer decompressing, you'll have less risk. So if you're going to ignore the helium penalty, you're increasing your risk. How much by? I can't tell you that. Nobody knows, but it's definitely increased risk. That's the defining thing. And one of the things I think it is important to point out about the kind of diving we do is that if you accept a particular algorithm, then you have to understand that the decompressions that it prescribes across the depth range are not ISO-risk. There are one or two ISO-risk algorithms that David has developed for the US Navy, but none of the ones we use as tech divers are like that. And what I mean by this is that as you go deeper, even when you're using the same algorithm, the risk gets greater, even though you're using the same algorithm. Like Bühlmann gradient factors 50, 70, a 50-meter dive is less risk than a 100-meter dive is less risk than a 150-meter dive. The risk gets greater the deeper you go. One of the things about the helium penalty is that because you tend to use more helium at those deeper depths, it's tended to prescribe increasingly conservative, it's imposed more helium penalty decompression time on these deeper dives. So I guess what I'm saying is the deeper you go and ignore the helium penalty, the more risk you're assuming. So ignoring the helium penalty on a 50-meter dive may not be as bad as ignoring it on a 100-meter dive, or even worse, a 150-meter dive. This is not based on any real data, really, except to say that we know that the helium penalty probably becomes more important as you go deeper because you're breathing more helium, and therefore ignoring it as you go deeper will impart more risk on the diving you do. So there's nothing magical about ignoring the helium penalty, and it doesn't say it magically adjust your risk so that it's the same as if you didn't ignore it. If you do less decompression, you're going to assume more risk. And actually that conversation we've just had kind of summarizes the whole thing. If you want to know what I recommend, I don't ignore the helium penalty. I've been diving kind of with it in place for the last 26 years since I started diving rebreathers, going pretty deep. It served me well. I've actually had musculoskeletal decompression sickness several times during that period, and so why would I volunteer? So what that tells me is I'm getting close to the edge of my envelope of risk, and I don't want to make it any more risky by arbitrarily ignoring what Bühlmann had in place when he designed his algorithm. If I do less decompression, I'm going to have more risk, so I don't do it. Yes, people are doing it and getting away with it. What that means is that they on that particular day, on that particular dive, it was okay. They can't say that means it will be okay every time. Definitely not. One of the things that has emerged in recent times, also David Doulet's work, is that the same diver doing the same dive, like absolutely the same dive, depth, time, decompression, temperature, workload. This is data from his experimental dives in the US Navy, so everything very carefully controlled. Same diver doing identical dives can produce markedly different bubble grades. Markedly different. It's like landmark study, really interesting. Freely available online, by the way. If you PubMed search Doulet DJ, you can find it. Published in DHM 2024. Anyway, what that tells us is that, you can do a dive one day that you produce no bubbles, and you can do exactly the same dive a week later and produce grade 4 bubbles. Well, he clearly showed that. So these people that say, well, okay, I've dived without the helium penalty, just ignored it and told my computer I was diving nitrogen, it was fine, so therefore I'm fine. It doesn't necessarily hold, because that intra-individual variability that David's demonstrated could come and bite you on the ass, on another dive a week or 2 weeks or whatever later. So you just need to be very careful about this. And I just come back to the fundamental message, which is, if you do less decompression, it's more risk. So I hope that's kind of answered your questions, Dom. But I'm happy to dig into it further if you want.
No, I mean, that's absolutely fascinating. I think getting that kind of the linkage that you've drawn there. So doing less decompression equals more risk, and going deeper breathing more helium equals more risk. So effectively, the point that you've just made there, you're putting risk on top of risk. Although, I think your point is also that it's not possible really to necessarily quantify that, and it will be different for the same individual on different days anyway. Several people have told me, in online comments, so obviously take that with a pinch of salt, that they or groups they're associated with are doing active research into this area and trying to study it. Now, you've obviously mentioned the stuff that goes on, with the US Navy that is, I guess, the gold standard research. Are you aware of, or are you involved in any other groups that are doing stuff in this area?
Short answer, no. Probably no. I'm editor of Diving and Hyperbaric Medicine journal and pretty well linked up with most of the serious researchers around the world. And I'm not aware of anyone who is actively looking at this. So it's not to say no one is. You just have to be careful. People talk about research amongst technical diving groups, but it's often essentially uncontrolled or non-standardized anecdote. And so I don't know of any research that's going on specifically to address this issue of the helium penalty. But I can virtually guarantee you the answer. I mean, if you do less risk than we all used to do when we assumed that Bühlmann had it right, if you do less less decompression than he prescribed, you are assuming more risk. You don't need research to determine that. I mean, there's decades of research in the US Navy where they're trying to minimize the amount of decompression that their military operators have to do because, decompression is time and time is risk in a military environment. They're trying to minimize that. So they're butting up against risk of decompression sickness. This is what their research is all about, is trying to minimize the amount of decompression they do. And, there's decades of data that show that the more decompression you do, the less the risk, and the less decompression you do, the more the risk. And so there's, you don't really need research to tell you that if you ignore the helium penalty, your risk is going to be higher. The only question is how high, and are you prepared to accept it? Yeah. If people are advocating for ignoring the helium penalty, then they kind of have to answer those questions as well. Okay, you're going to have higher risk. We can't really quantify that change. I mean, that would be an interesting thing perhaps to do in a research project, but it'd be very hard and you'd need big data for it because, like I say, all this individual variability makes studying this kind of thing very difficult. But, are you aware that there's an increased risk, and are you prepared to accept it? And I think that is a perspective that's sometimes missing from these online discussions that occur. That you do get the sense that there are some people who think that they can ignore the helium penalty and their risk isn't changed. Well, that's nonsense. It's just nonsense. If you do less decompression, there's more risk. No question.
I don't know if you thought I was, but I'm not advocating getting rid of the helium penalty. I've just been involved in these discussions, and there are people who are absolutely out there who are saying the helium penalty doesn't exist, there is no risk, or the risk is very marginal. That's one of the reasons I thought I would reach out, because you are really well trusted, you're really well known, and I think it's kind of useful to get it direct from you in the way that you have just done and made it really clear. Two things: go deeper, you increase the risk. Don't do as much deco, you increase the risk. Now, those things shouldn't be rocket science, but I think going deeper has been normalised. I don't know, 20 years ago, 100 metres was incredible, wasn't it? But there are lots and lots of people doing dives to those depths and well beyond.
Yeah, look, I mean, we're kind of getting slightly away from the helium penalty, but it is worth pointing out that your point is exactly right. The way technical diving has evolved is, towards deeper dives. It's also involves, in certain locations, it involves repetitive technical diving. So, places like Truck Lagoon, where people might be doing 2 dives a day, that kind of stuff. A lot of it is outside the envelope of what Bühlmann actually tested when he developed his algorithm. And, we need to understand that. We're extrapolating his testing program into contexts where it was never tested or intended for. So we're breaking new ground, and there's risk associated with that. But yeah, it is important people understand there's nothing magical about ignoring the helium penalty. Okay, well, the helium penalty may not exist in the kind of diving we do. It may be true, but if you're going to do less decompression than you used to do, then you're going to have more risk. It's very simple. And the other thing I'd quite like to say, Dom, I think it's important to get out there from me. I'm a very impartial observer in this space. I'm a scientist and a diving physician, and I follow the science, right? So you look for evidence. I don't want to be seen as politically aligned with any particular group that's doing one thing or the other. All I'm interested in is safety for me and my colleagues. That's you and your audience. That's my primary motivation. This isn't a political discussion. Unfortunately, these things sometimes get politicized. Like, for example, if a particular group says, okay, the helium penalty is rubbish, and then another group says it isn't, then you've got a political kind of conflict. And I don't want any part of that. I just want to provide objective commentary, narrative, evidence where it's available to my technical diving colleagues, and that's what I'm trying to do here.
That's understood and really appreciated. I mean, I don't think there's any organisation that's advocating getting rid of the helium penalty. I'm certainly not aware of them, and I'm not speaking or representing any particular organisation other than I do a lot of diving myself. I had 4 really good mates of mine bent last year. One of them's never going to dive again. And a few other being really restricted. So, I guess I don't want that to happen to me in the nicest possible sense. And nobody loves deco, nobody wants to do more deco than we have to. So I guess there's a bit of self-interest there, but also, it is, I think, useful for people to get the thoughts of someone like yourself.
Yeah, look, at all times, I think divers in our cohort, our technical diving colleagues, should have in mind what David showed in that recent study, that 2024 study. So same diver, identical dives multiple times, and markedly different bubbling. And what that tells you is that you can't just say, I ignored the helium penalty once and I was fine, therefore that's a legitimate strategy. Because the next time or the next time or the next time, you could run into problems. It is one of the difficulties of the whole area of decompression, that it would seem that the profile, so the time, the depth, the decompression stops, how you distribute them, what you're doing during them, and the temperature of the water, which we know is an influence, it would seem that is far from the only influence on how much you bubble on any one day. And it kind of puts into perspective all this debate about helium penalties or not, because that... you will increase risk by ignoring the helium penalty, but that might shift the risk needle by a small amount. Other things would appear that we don't yet understand can shift it by a large amount. Anyway, the point is, I come right back to my initial point, which was, if you do less decompression, you've got more risk, and that risk can vary quite a lot. So, getting away with it once doesn't necessarily mean much. You just need to not overinterpret that.
Okay, that's absolutely fantastic, and would be a nice way to finish. Apart from, I just want to pick up on one of those points that you just made, which is about unknown risk factors. Are there any thoughts about the sorts of things that may change you from a low grade bubble to a level 4 bubble?
Yeah, it's fascinating. It really is fascinating. There are some thoughts. In fact, my own group have just received some funding from various organizations, including Dan and the US Navy, to look at some of these things. And I might add, in our world, funding for research is extraordinarily difficult to come by, and we're very grateful to those organizations, groups like Dan, the US Navy, Shearwater, various groups, but those in particular have just been amazing with funding. Anyway, we're exploring a few things. So it's possible that what you do in the 24-hour period leading up to a dive might be influential. So things like diet, exercise, sleep, various parameters that might change your body's inflammatory state. They're all possibilities. And of course, isolating each one of them and individually testing each one of them is really challenging, because you need big numbers and subjects who are engaged in the process to standardize what they do in the day leading up to an experimental dive. It really is quite a challenge to study this kind of thing, but work is underway, and our group is working on that. We're about to start a program for one of our PhD students who'll be looking very carefully at one aspect of that. So largely focused on exercise over the day prior to a dive, exercise patterns, what you do in your day, and how that might influence bubbling. So that's about to start here in Auckland. And there are probably other things happening around the world as well. It's not my work, so I won't talk about it. But yeah, we're working on it, but right now we don't have the answers.
I guess there's a whole load of stuff we know. You shouldn't go and, dive with a hangover, or body needs to be in the best possible state, I guess. But other than that, you can't really offer any more thoughts. No,
I don't think we can right now. There are some things that just make sense, right? And people talk a lot about hydration. Actually, hydration as an influence on bubbling has been looked at a little bit, and the evidence isn't particularly strong on that. But equally, I'm not saying, so people don't overinterpret it. I think being well hydrated based on first principles alone makes sense prior to a big technical dive. Getting dehydrated during the dive, a 4 or 5 hour dive, you can pee a lot out and you can become dehydrated, and that will reduce tissue perfusion and reduce inert gas washout. So being well hydrated, not overhydrated, but well hydrated is probably makes sense. Yeah, all the things that we do tend to focus on and say that are appropriate are right, well rested, not hungover, hydrated, those kind of things. But objective answers, like solid evidence-based answers, are far and few between. It is actually all at once frustrating, but one of the exciting things about our field is that there are still these low-hanging fruit questions that are of high practical relevance to the community. It's exactly the sort of thing we love studying because it is of such high practical relevance. And of course, I'm an end user myself, so I'm very invested in getting the right answers for us. Because I'm one of you, right? So, yeah. And so are the people that work with me.
I kind of view it as really fascinating that we've been doing this kind of diving for a very long period of time, or, so it seems, and yet, these kind of questions still don't have really clear answers.
Yeah. Well, you're exactly right. And look, part of the reason for that is that it's not child cancer, it's not, and so research funding from the traditional research funders, like the big organizations that fund research in any country, you go to them asking for money to study, the adverse consequences of a discretionary recreational activity that's engaged in mainly by white middle-class males, they'll just laugh at you. And I guess rightly so. There are higher priorities for research out there, for medical research. We're just lucky, and I come back to it, my gratitude to the various organizations that do fund this kind of research. We're just lucky there are some, these organizations, various philanthropists. Our freediving study in Dominica was funded by an American philanthropist who we're very grateful to. All of this is terrific, but it's hard to get money to study. And that's why these questions still exist, your point, that... Yeah. Research in this area is difficult to do, and it's difficult to get funding for.
I guess we should just be grateful that the military still have an interest in sending people down relatively deep, and they haven't got around to the idea that it all needs to be done by ROVs yet.
No, well, no. I mean, a lot of what they want to do can't be done by ROVs, and yep, they are still on board, very much so.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you very much, Simon. I really appreciate you spending your time to kind of go through these questions and be so honest, I guess, and straightforward as well, which is really appreciated. Just to kind of conclude, are there any final message you want to give across?
Honestly, Dom, you get me talking on a podcast about diving physiology and medicine, and we could talk all day. I mean, there are so many things I'm passionate about, right? But no, I'd just say that on this helium penalty question, when you boil it all down, it's simple. If you do less decompression, there's more risk. And you have to decide, given that you can't really quantify that change in risk, whether you're prepared to accept that. And if you are, fine, but if you're not, I'd just do what I do, which is stay with the old algorithm and be honest with my computer.
Thank you very much, Simon, for those incredible thoughts, for spending so much time going through that with us. For everyone watching this, I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned as much as I have. Of course, if you want to leave some comments, if you want to ask some questions, I will see if I can get Simon to answer them. Otherwise, if you could do all the usual stuff, leave us a like, subscribe, share it with your friends, all those kind of things, it would be brilliant. I'm Dom Robinson, Deep Wreck Diver. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I shall look forward to seeing you on the next one.